Okay, let's talk about primary productivity, or just we'll use the term productivity as a general term because it comes in different forms. So here's the idea, and we've already discussed this in class. The sun is basically the sole source of all energy on Earth, except for a few ecosystems that exist deep in the oceans that use chemical energy coming out of volcanic vents. But for the most part, at the surface of the Earth, in the oceans and lakes and the rivers, is the sun that provides the energy that fuels everything. And it does it by the process of photosynthesis, which happens in the chlorophyll of green plants. And this is something we've been talking about lately. So basically, plants take carbon dioxide and water, two low energy molecules. They take energy from the sun and they use it to convert it into this right here, a carbon compound called glucose, which is very high in energy. So the energy from the sun ends up here, and then there's this excess oxygen. And this process is called photosynthesis. Now, remember, the first law of thermodynamics tells us you can't create or destroy energy. It has to come from somewhere. It has to go to somewhere. So the idea is the energy that comes from the sun that got absorbed by the plant, it didn't go into the oxygen. It went into the glucose molecule. So it had to go from somewhere, the sun, and it ended up somewhere, the glucose. So glucose is basically a place where energy is stored in living systems. And just so you know, I mean, this is what a glucose molecule looks like, and it can be hooked together to make starches, or it can be broken apart and rearranged to make fats. But ultimately, these carbon chain molecules, this is where the energy is stored in ecosystems. And the way this energy got captured was through the actions of photosynthetic plants, and we call this productivity. Now, just so we remember now, the way we release this energy is through respiration. All living organisms, including plants, decomposers, you and me, they basically take these carbon compounds, glucose, which has a lot of energy in it, react it with oxygen, which we breathe in, turn it back into low energy carbon dioxide and water, and that excess energy is what's used to drive living systems. It moves the muscles in your body and the nerve cells in your brain and so on. So, in order to look at large systems like the Earth or parts of the Earth, we talk in terms of what's called primary productivity. And basically, what that means is it is the production of carbon compounds by plants. So, productivity is just we're saying like, look, plants are producing glucose and capturing solar energy and making it available to the whole ecosystem. We call that concept primary productivity, and we're going to differentiate into different aspects of productivity. But let's start with this. It's all about sunlight, and you might have noticed in the morning when the sun is low in the sky, it's not very warm. But in the middle of the day, when the sun's overhead, it's really a lot hotter, and that has to do with the concentration of energy. So anytime light is coming straight down, like it does at the equator, let's say, or at noon, there's the energy is very concentrated. So the productivity is going to be higher. There's a lot more photosynthesis that can happen here than could happen over here. It's the same light, but now it's spread out over an area. And so when the sun is low in the sky, or we're far from the equator where the sun is spread out, we find that productivity is diminished because there's less solar energy landing on a leaf in order for it to convert into glucose molecules. So here's an image of the Earth showing this idea. The sun rays come in parallel. Near the equator, they land on a small area. So there's a lot of energy concentrated here. So we have a lot of productivity. We can convert a lot of sunlight into sugars. Here, that same amount of light gets spread out over a much larger area. So a leaf of the same size in these two areas, this leaf would have less light landing on it, so it could be less productive. It could perform less photosynthesis. It could produce fewer sugars per day. So to differentiate productivity into different types, gross primary productivity, which we're going to call GPP. GPP is simply the total amount of sugars that got manufactured in the course of a period of time by a certain unit of land area. So basically, if I have a forest in a given day, this forest was able to produce this many sugar molecules. So we could measure different ways. We could talk about it in terms of the kilograms of sugar produced in a given area. So usually we do it in terms of energy or mass per unit of area per unit of time. So let's look at this. I could say how many kilograms of sugar were produced in every square meter of forest in a given year. That would be the productivity of the forest in kilograms square meters per year. Or I could just talk about a leaf. We say, okay, well, this leaf captures a certain number of joules of energy per square meter of leaf per second. It doesn't matter what units we use, but if you'll notice, its energy is in the numerator. It's how much energy we got, or we can measure that energy in terms of the grams of sugar per square meter of surface area, in which green plants are existing. It could be leaf area or just whole forest per unit of time. And so gross primary productivity is just how much sugar got produced. I'm not caring about what happened to it. But the thing is, although plants are producing these sugars, they also have to eat these sugars, right? They also have to respire. All cells in every organism on the planet is respiring constantly at all moments of the day. So then what we realize is, well, since plants are both making sugars and eating sugars, what we are often interested in is what's called the net primary productivity. And that is basically the extra amounts of sugar. The plants always make more sugar than they need. Because it's going to be dark. And when it's dark, they still need access to glucose. So they tend to manufacture more than they need. And fortunately, they manufacture a lot more than they need. And that makes it possible for us non-plant organisms to survive by eating plants. So just think of it this way. Net productivity, NPP, is gross productivity. So the total amount of sugars produced minus the amount of sugar that the plant consumes through respiration. So the plant makes this much, but then it consumes this much, and this is how much is left over. So net primary productivity, NPP, that's what's available for the rest of the system. Now, it's worth noting that under ideal situations, plants are not that efficient, just like solar panels are not that efficient. They're able to capture about 1.5% of the light energy that touches their surface. So most solar energy just makes the leaves warm, but 1.5% of it gets captured and converted into sugars. However, about half of a percentage is used by the plant for respiration. So about a third of the energy the plant captures is going to use in order to live, which leaves about 1% of the total amount of light energy hitting a plant actually gets stored in the plant as leaves, as fruits, as seeds, as flowers, as other parts of it. Okay, so NPP is going to be measured in the same thing as GPP. It's just basically how much energy got captured minus how much got used through respiration. How many kilograms of sugar got captured minus how many got used through respiration. Now, here's why it's so important, though, because it is this extra amount of energy that plants make that is available to the organisms. So this deer is taking advantage of the fact that the plant made more sugars than it needed. And so now the deer can eat those, and now it can use those sugars to drive us by. Now, we could shoot this deer, measure its mass, and when we measure them, when we talk about, well, anyway, I don't want to get too far ahead, but the point is, the energy is now in the deer. I shoot the deer, I eat the deer, the energy is now in me. But ultimately, all that energy was in PP. It was the extra amount that the plant made that it didn't need at that moment. So this is what I was getting a little bit ahead of myself. So biomass is just one way of measuring energy. So I could talk kilograms of glucose. Well, I could talk, kilograms of chi. Now, when we talk about biomass, the idea is carbon compounds, whether it be sugars, starches, fats. They basically contain a lot of energy because they have a lot of carbon-carbon bonds, a lot of carbon-hydrogen bonds. But the water that is the bulk of many organisms, you're mostly water. Water doesn't really have any energy content. Remember, it's a low energy molecule. So when we talk about biomass, we have to dry out. If we're going to measure biomass, we have to get all the water out of it. So this lab you just did, we took leaves and we had to make sure they were dry leaves, because if they're wet leaves, well, we don't really know. That's not that the water in there is not contributing to the energy. It's the carbon compounds that is. So a very useful way of measuring NPP is to measure how much biomass of growth that we get. So you just take any living system, it could be a plant, it could be an animal, dry it out, which means you have to kill it, and then you measure its mass, and you just say, okay, how many kilograms of biomass do I have? How many grams of biomass do I have? And we can just use that as a way of measuring net primary productivity. We say, how many kilograms of biomass is in this forest per square meters of forest per year? So remember, productivity is always going to be expressed in terms of energy units, whether joules or biomass units, per square area, per time. I think that's it for this. No, okay. Oh, yeah. So we're pointing out this too. So the productivity on our planet in different areas varies depending on things that limit productivity. Okay, so for instance, light. Without light, you can't have productivity because you need that for photosynthesis. Well, what we found is that at the poles, as I get closer to the poles, there's less light. It's more spread out, so I can have less productivity. As I get closer to the equator, I'm going to have more productivity because the light is more concentrated. Similarly, temperature. When it's very cold, it's difficult for photosynthesis to happen. The warmer it gets, the easier it is. So what we find is places that are tropical, where it's warm, have higher temperatures, and therefore the plants can be more productive. Precipitation is another important one. Consider a desert and a forest that are at the same latitude. They're getting the same amount of light. They could be at the same temperature. Deserts aren't always necessarily hot, but because there's less water present in a desert, there's less photosynthesis that can happen because you need water to do photosynthesis. So that limits how much GPP and NPP we can have. And then another one is nutrients. If you don't have nitrogen and phosphorus, as well as water and carbon dioxide, you can't be productive. And a classic example of this is if you look at tropical oceans, when you get close to the shorelines, rivers bring in lots of nutrients that get brought in from the rivers. So close to the shores, there's a lot of productivity in the oceans. There's a lot of biomass being accumulated. But if you got in the open oceans far from the shores, what you find is everything's the same, except the nutrients aren't there anymore. And so the productivity out there is a lot less. So the amount of biomass that can be accumulated in a biological system depends on these four factors here. And this is just a look at just different parts of the world. So we look at tropical rainforests. We see now we're expressing here in terms of grams per square meter per year instead of kilograms. And we find here's a tropical rainforest. Here's a tropical seasonal forest. So it has a little bit less water, so a little bit less productivity. Now, if we go to a temperate area, we see we have a little bit less, and that's because there's less light there and less temperature. Go to a boreal forest. We'll talk about that's basically a northern forest, like you have in northern Canada and Siberia. You have less light, you have lower temperature, you have less productivity. All right. So anyway, that's productivity. Thanks for watching, and be prepared to answer some questions about this when we come to class tomorrow.